The gentlewoman, Madam Speaker Pelosi, is recognized from California.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank the gentleman for yielding. I thank him for his leadership on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and Congresswoman Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, the ranking Republican on the committee, for their leadership in bringing this resolution to the floor. It isn't without a tear in the eye that we bring this to the floor and remember our colleague, Congressman Tom Lantos, and how important this resolution would have been to him. 20 years ago, when I was a new member of Congress, Tom invited some of us to a meeting that I will never forget. It was with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and at that time he presented to us his proposal for autonomy for Tibet. As over 20 years ago, he has been preaching autonomy, and it's on that basis that we wanted him to have the opportunity to have full negotiations with the Chinese government. They have said if he doesn't reject the idea of independence, that cannot happen. Well, he rejected independence 20 years ago, much to the dismay of those who want independence. But in any event, Tom Lantos opened the door for many of us to meet with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and 20 years later, in the capital of the United States, under Tom's leadership and that of Congresswoman Ros-Lehtinen, we were able to present to His Holiness the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest honor that this body can bestow. And I'm proud to say that President Bush stood there side by side with His Holiness presenting our Congressional Gold Medal to him. No president before had been so courageous, and I appreciate and am proud that President Bush did that. Following that, we talked about taking a trip to India to talk about global warming. Our Energy Independence and Global Warming Task Force, which Mr. Markey and Mr. Sensenbrenner, who spoke so eloquently earlier, were in the lead on. When we planned the trip, we had accepted His Holiness's invitation to visit him in Dharamsala, without any thought that it would be at a controversial time. As fate would have it, we made our plans December, January. When we got there in the middle of March, it was following the crackdown in Tibet of the peaceful demonstrators in Lhasa and in other parts of Tibet by the Chinese government. It was stunning, really, to see the reaction of the Chinese to the simple observance of the 10-year anniversary, the 49th anniversary of the Dalai Lama being forced out of Tibet by the Chinese, as the monks demonstrated and protested the Chinese government cracked down. While we were there, it was interesting to hear that the government of China was saying that His Holiness was the instigator of violence in China. He had a heart of a jackal, all kinds of animal references, and we all love our animals, but they were not appropriate to His Holiness. And we all know His Holiness to be the personification of nonviolence in the world, a bridge builder for peace and human understanding, as we said in our presentation of the Congressional Gold Medal to him. So we thought it must be our fate, it must be our karma, that we would be in Dharamsala at that time, when, as was indicated by some of our colleagues, Mr. Inslee mentioned that some monks had traveled for 5 days over the Himalayas to Dharamsala to tell us about the treatment they had received. Some of the people we met with, Mr. Smith, had been in prison for many years in China. One woman who was in her 80s had been in prison for over 25 years. We heard of the torture that was exacted upon them as recently as a matter of days before we were there. So the torture that you described that you heard about it in your committee, continues to this day, and we very tearfully received that information from the prisoners. But the point is that in China you are arrested and repressed, and in Tibet for what you believe, not even for acting upon your beliefs, but for what you believe. And that is something that flies in the face of everything we stand for as a country. That's why I was so pleased that the President stood there and showed bipartisan spirit, Democrats and Republicans coming together. As Mr. Smith mentioned, we've worked on this issue for many years, and in a very bipartisan way in terms of China. Another place where China has influence that Mr. Smith and Mr. Wolf have been leaders has been in the Sudan. And but for the Chinese absolute insistence that they will not sanction the Sudan at the UN, we could perhaps have an improved human rights situation and the political situation in Sudan. Many of us took a trip, many members have been there. I led a delegation there with Mr. Clyburn to Darfur a couple of years ago, and we saw firsthand the genocide that was going on there. It was horrible to see. In one camp, we went to several camps. In one camp, 100,000 refugees were there. We saw the little children. The tiny ones really still had some brightness in their eyes. The older ones, they had seen too much. In this camp, in the evening when it would be cool, if the father went out to get firewood, he would be killed. If the mother went out, she could be raped, and in any event, the children could be kidnapped. They had been displaced from their villages with the compliance of the government of Sudan. All we need is strong international leadership to end that situation. China stands in the way. So we're talking about Tibet, and when we're talking about the Olympics, and we're talking about Tibet, we have to remember Burma as well, and the house arrest of Aung San Suu Kyi for all these many years. We have to remember what is happening in Darfur. I was reading the paper the other day as the torch was going through Paris that one of the carriers of the torch said that what was happening with the protesters was very unpleasant. And I thought, you think that's unpleasant? Maybe you should be in the subhuman conditions that the refugees are in Darfur. If you think that's unpleasant, maybe you should be in a prison in Tibet for your faith in His Holiness the Dalai Lama. If you think that's unpleasant, maybe you could still be in prison from the Tiananmen Square massacre. Some people are still in prison from that time. Mr. Smith knows well, Mr. Chris Smith knows well, the fight we had at the time, because at the time we had about a $5 billion, shortly after, a couple of years after Tiananmen, where we were fighting for the release of the prisoners from Tiananmen, we had about a $5 billion a year trade deficit. And we thought, remember, Chris, we thought that that would give us so much leverage with the Chinese government that surely if we threatened the most favored nation status, as it was called then, that they would yield and release these prisoners because it meant $5 billion a year to them. Well, we didn't win. We didn't prevail in that situation. And as I say, it was a Republican president and a Democratic president. We didn't get any better policy from either of them when it came to China. They told us that granting most favored nation status, they changed the name to permanent normal trade relations because it sounded better, would in fact improve the political situation in China and improve our trade relationship with China. And so when these people are saying it's unpleasant, I think it's unpleasant to think about that $5 billion a year trade deficit, Mr. Chairman, is now $5 billion a week. $5 billion a week. And that is a $250 billion a year trade deficit with China. Has it improved our trade relationship? I don't think so. Has it improved the human rights situation in China? I don't think so. So somewhere along the way, we lost our way. We said at the time, some of us, if you choose to ride this tiger that is China, only China will decide when you can get off. So China won the Olympics. Some of us supported resolutions in opposition to that, but they won the Olympics. And I don't support a boycott of the Olympics. I think our athletes who have trained should be able to go there and compete. And I think it should be treated as a sports event. Anytime it tries to rise to the occasion of harmony and one dream, unifying factor, that's where it falls short. Because the Chinese cannot, on the one hand, take the political upside of the credibility given to them at any welcoming ceremony and refuse to hear the other side of the political view that they are unworthy of making that claim. As we speak tonight, as we're gathered here in this chamber in my city of San Francisco, human rights activists are preparing for the torch to come through our city, a city very committed to human rights, tomorrow. I was very proud that yesterday they were able to display one world, one dream, free Tibet banner across the Golden Gate Bridge. It's just frightening to think of how they were able to accomplish it. But they got their message across with probably, in my view, the most beautiful backdrop in the world for all the world to see. Tomorrow, as the torch goes through the city, people will voice their views on it. But still tonight, Desmond Tutu is leading a prayer vigil in San Francisco in protest of what is happening with that torch going through. Probably the most insulting of all, though, is that China insists that the torch go through Tibet, that it go to Mount Everest and through Tibet on its way back to Beijing. That's the biggest insult, I think, of all. The world should not allow that to happen. What's right about that? When I was in Dharamsala, I had the privilege of addressing the crowd gathered in the square, and I said at the time that the situation in Tibet challenges the conscience of the world. Indeed, the situation in Darfur challenges the conscience of the world, two places where China can change, make a difference. I also said that if we, as freedom-loving people throughout the world, do not stand up for human rights in China and Tibet, then we lose all moral authority to talk about it any other place in the world. And so it is many years of activism on this subject and lots of documentation. But as Mr. Smith mentioned, we know so many of the people firsthand, Harry Wu, who have been imprisoned. And why this is important tonight is because what the Chinese do, the most excruciating form of torture that an oppressor can exact on a political prisoner is to say to him or to her, nobody even knows you're here. They don't even care about you anymore. Society has passed this issue by. It's no longer important. And their family is out there suffering. You're out and you're here forgotten. But the world does not remember you. Well, we're here tonight to say that the world does. Continuation of the work that Mr. Smith referenced and others have referenced tonight about our calling to the attention of the world, the names, the actual names of people who have been imprisoned for their beliefs, their religious beliefs, their political beliefs. And so this resolution is very simple. And when we vote on it tomorrow, I hope we have an overwhelming vote. Because what it says to the Chinese government as they prepare for the Olympics in harmony, one world, one dream, free Tibet, is that they end the crackdown in Tibet, that they enter into substantive dialogue directly with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, that they allow independent monitors, journalists, and others into Tibet, and they also allow medical personnel, as was mentioned, people who have been beaten by the Chinese cannot receive medical assistance, and they need those life-saving attention. That's what we're talking about here. And as for the accusation that that jackal, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, the instigator of violence in Tibet, started all of this, His Holiness called for, and our delegation in Dharamsala associated ourselves with his call, which was for an independent, outside investigation as to how that all started. If they're going to accuse him, then they must be prepared to have an investigation to prove their point or to be proven wrong. When we were there, I just want to close by saying this because it was very moving for us. When we got off the airplane and we were driving to Dharamsala for miles and miles and miles and miles, and when we got to Dharamsala, to the center of town, we were greeted by many Tibetans flying American flags. You know, anytime we see the flag or we take the pledge in the morning, it's an emotional experience for us. But to see these people who had to struggle so much for freedom pay homage to our flag was quite a remarkable thing. And here, could you move this over, please? Yeah. Here is one sign which was my particular favorite. It said, "Thank you for everything you have done for us so far." But all the American flags and the Tibetan flags, and just, again, it was just a forest of flags there. And then we had The other flag. Mr. Holt referenced the children. When we went to the children's school, we had thousands of adorable children, many of them separated from their families because that's the only way they could be raised in the Tibetan culture, which is now restrained. Here's these children, and they had thousands of these, brought many of them home. The American flag on one side, and on the other side, a Tibetan flag. Free Tibet, it goes on. Long live His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Long live the friendship in the United States and Tibet. A friendship that began when Franklin Roosevelt sent His Holiness, when he was a very little boy, a watch. That watch had the rising of the sun, the months of the year, the phases of the moon, and it did tell time, too. And it was a very special gift, a gold watch. His Holiness has said that he took that watch with him when he left Tibet. Imagine a piece of America in that flight to freedom. It is our wish that under the provisions of this legislation and the voices being heard all over the world now, that those negotiations will take place between the Chinese government and His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Many have asked about the opening ceremonies. You don't want to boycott the Olympics. What about the opening ceremonies? And I have said that I think we should, since the Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, has put that on the table, it should stay there. And our President should hold back on any decision about going to those opening ceremonies until he sees what progress could be made, what leverage we could use to have those negotiations take place, so that before too long, and while His Holiness is in still good health, he can return to Tibet, and indeed the Tibetan people in their autonomous state of Tibet can be free. So I'm very proud of this resolution. I couldn't be prouder of all the statements that were made this evening, with all the passion and interest and history that went with it. I think it is a tribute to His Holiness, and I hope the vote tomorrow will be unequivocal about that. I'm certain it will. But I also think it's a tribute to our friend Tom Lantos, who did so faithful to this. Thank you, Mr. Smith. With that, Madam Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time. You can come look at these pictures anytime you want.
The gentleman from